So today I'm going to take you through the person-centered theory of personality and personality change. It's a lot in one, but I wanted to do it all in one because all these concepts interrelate, and I didn't want there to be sort of a big gap between them. And so the objectives, I want to hopefully for us to build a deeper understanding of what theory of person-centered personality and change is, and then to reflect on that in practice with our clients. So everything I'm going to go through for the theory part of this comes from this chapter, which Roger's titled The Theory of Therapy, Personality, and Interpersonal Relationships as Developed in the Client-Centered Framework. Snappy. It's a bit of an unusual one for him. He, as you may have noticed, likes flowery seems a bit judgmental, but like pretty prose, and this is a lot more logical. Like he's obviously been asked to write a chapter specifically for a certain type of book, so he's had to construct his theory in a much more step-by-step process, which is why I found it helpful for this. I guess a question then of change is, what is it that's changing? And so a word we can use for that is personality. We could call it the mind, the psyche, but something's changing, and each therapy must kind of have a rationale or a framework of what is changing and how it's changing. And so we're going to call the thing that's changing personality. And as Ruth pointed out, that's hopefully in the direction of relieving suffering. But as you guys have pointed out, it might also be for self-awareness, or just to cope, to keep your head above water. Yeah. And so as we go through this, I would, I'm going to split this into two. So I'm going to go through the theory, and then the second part will be, I'm going to invite you guys to bring clients to mind to discuss, to fit into this theory, to see how it might apply to them. In doing that, please don't raise any identifiable features of them, no names, nothing that you need to say to make sense of it in terms of this theory. And please don't discuss what we talk about outside of this session. So I'll get to the theory. So I've broken this down into 10 concepts. The first one is this actualizing tendency. So this is the fuel, the driving factor in not just human beings, but all organisms. And similar, it could be analogous to like Freud's libido, but it's basically, we have this pull to grow, just like in the picture here where this acorn, it has this inner potential to be that oak tree if it's given the right sufficient conditions. And so that's kind of within it to grow to its potential. And that's the driving force that's he's claiming is within us as well. So the therapist in this context isn't giving their clients goals and juice to get there. That's assumed to be within each of us. However, there might be obstacles that are blocking us from growing. And so it changes the frame of therapy from how do we remove the obstacles to our inherent growth tendency. So Roger says, this is the inherent tendency of the organism to develop all of its capacities to maintain or enhance itself. Life processes do not merely preserve life, but transcend the status quo of the organism, expanding itself continually and imposing its autonomous determination upon an ever-increasing realm of events. So our tendency isn't just to stay static, stay the same, but it is to grow. The second concept, and by the way, please interrupt me if you have a question about these or aren't getting it, because they link up. They're not separate concepts. They really entwine. So it's important to understand one before the next one. So the organismic valuing process. So we have this tendency to grow, but how do we know if we're growing or not? Well, it's saying quite simply that when things happen to us or we do things which are helping us actualize in some way. It feels good. We have positive feelings, positive emotions. And when we're doing something that's threatening our growth, threatening our potential, threatening our needs, it feels bad. We have emotions that we associate with suffering, anxiety, anger, depression. And Roger says, experiences which are perceived as maintaining or enhancing the organism are valued positively, and those which are perceived as negating such maintenance or enhancement are valued negatively. So if our needs are met, it feels good, and if they're not, it feels bad, or if things block them, it feels bad. This is a type of feedback mechanism. So this feedback keeps the organism on the beam of satisfying his motivational needs. Thus, all our behavior is the attempt to satisfy needs for actualization. Is that clear enough so far, those two concepts? And so that's relevant to all organisms. Now we get into what is unique to being human. So we have all this experience which helps us feel whether our needs are being met or not. But in some sense, we split this experience into two, and some of it we call I or me. So some of my experience feels like it's me doing it, and we call this self-experience. So for example, it would sound unusual for me to say, I'm beating my heart, because we don't tend to associate that with me doing it, but we say my heart beats. Whereas if I said to you, my body ate this morning, that might sound a bit odd. You'd expect me to say, I ate this morning, because we associate that with my identity as something I'm doing. So experience that we associate with being or functioning becomes symbolized as me and differentiated from experience that is not me. And so then all these experiences of me pile up, and we create this image in our mind of who we are. And this is what Rogers calls our self-concept. So this self-experience becomes elaborated into a concept of self, becomes a perpetual object in one's experiential field. So we have a tendency to grow. We have feelings that tell us whether we're growing or not. And some of these feelings and awareness of our functioning, we identify into a model of who we are. And we carry that around with us everywhere. And it kind of implicitly shapes the way we view every situation. Now, because we have this objectifying of ourselves in our mind, this self-concept, it can be seen, part of it could be seen as positive or negative. Do I like this thing I call me? Do I not? Do other people like this thing called me? Do they not? And Rogers says that we actually have a need to be felt to be seen positively. He doesn't go into too much detail as to why this might be, but when you look at this picture here, I think, to me, it's kind of obvious. When we're infants, we're so vulnerable and dependent that we need other people to look after us. And so to know whether they have some sort of motivation to do that, we would like to think they see us positively. And this is me now, not Rogers. But this could even transcend infancy, right? Because we're a social species, and you know, in our evolutionary history, if we're not seen positively by the tribe, that's going to get us into trouble. So Rogers says, as the awareness of self emerges, the individual develops a need for positive regard, and this is universal in human beings. Guys with me so far? Yeah, great. I've underlined this because this is one of the key aspects of the theory. The expression of positive regard by a significant social other can become more compelling than the organismic valuing process. So that bit at the beginning, that bit that tells us whether things feel good or not, that tells us if we're growing in the right direction or not, that can be overridden by someone seeing us positively. So I might not particularly like doing something, and my organism tells me that by saying it doesn't feel particularly good. But when I do it, if mum looks ecstatically happy that I've done it, then suddenly, oh, that feels quite good. So now it's distorted. Do I really like doing this thing? Or the other way around, maybe I quite enjoy something, but each time I do it and I associate it with me and I get a disapproving look, oh, that doesn't feel too good. So whether we feel our self is being seen positively or not can override the process of what our organism is telling us we need to meet our needs. And so then this, like our self-experiences get shaped into a self-concept in general, other people's regard for us can get internalized as our own regard for ourselves. And we don't just need positive regard from others, but he's saying we also need positive self-regard. So he says a need for self-good regard develops out of the association of self-experiences with the satisfaction or frustration of the need for positive regard. So when we experience things that feel like me, whether that's seen positively or negatively, shapes the way I end up viewing those experiences myself, the way I value those experiences. Thus, we come to experience positive regard or loss of positive regard independently of transactions with others. So let's try and think. I used a few examples of the last group. So let's say, because this is quite a common one, let's say there's, in the family structure growing up, there's negative associations with anything sexual. And maybe a child is caught like playing with themselves or something sexually, and that gets very told off and shamed and internalized. Then that only needs to happen a few times before the person learns to associate the shame of that activity on its own, regardless if anyone's there to shame it. So we come to experience that self-valuing, that self-regard independently of others doing it to us. And these then develop into what Rogers calls conditions of worth. So our self-regard then becomes dependent on us being a certain way, depending on how we've been interacted with in the past. If to the degree to which our self-experiences are disapproved of, or we feel like they're disapproved of, and for example, shamed, is the degree to which we deny that from our self-concept, because we need to see ourselves positively. So we can only let in things into the self-concepts which have been sort of valued. So Rogers describes it like this. When a self-experience is avoided or sought solely because it's less or more worthy of self-regard, the individual is said to have acquired a condition of worth. I've got an example here to explain it a bit further. So to know whether he's receiving love or not, the infant must observe his mother's face and gestures. Each new experience of love or rejection tends to alter the whole gestalt. By gestalt, he means here specifically the self-concept or the worth attached to the self-concept. So important is this to the infant that he comes to be guided not by the degree to which an experience maintains or enhances the organism, but by the likelihood of receiving love, or at least approval or acceptance. So some behaviors that are regarded positively, which are not actually experienced organismically as satisfying. And other behaviors are regarded negatively, which are not actually experienced as unsatisfying. When he behaves in accordance with these introjected values, introjected meaning they've come in externally, they're not our own inner valuing process, but family, culture, others has instilled them into us, then he has acquired a condition of worth. He cannot regard himself positively unless he lives in terms of these conditions. So another example. So the sex example might be one in which something feels good to our organism, but it's not received, it's not approved of in our family or social structure. So then we disregard it to ourselves as negative, and we might build a self-concept which sort of disowns sexuality. The flip side of that is pulling in experiences which we didn't actually value, but which others really want us to do, and others approve of us if we do. So an example might be a client who is training to become a doctor, and his family was growing up was assuming and expecting he would become a doctor. Your dad was a doctor, his father was a doctor before you. It's just built into the family system, and this person might have never actually considered if that's what they want. It's just been assumed, and they might be struggling because they've never really considered this, and it would be threatening to them to recognize that it might be something they don't want or they don't enjoy, because to then deny that might get them some negative regard. So this builds this, like we covered before, incongruence. This then leads to incongruence in the self structure, which Rogers defines like this: experiences which run contrary to our conditions of worth are perceived selectively and distorted to match our conditions of worth, or are denied to awareness. So if we have an experience which doesn't match our conditions, we'll either distort it to make it fit them, or we'll just deny them. So these are where defenses start to come in. And this is what it means to be incongruent. So our concept of self includes distorted perceptions which do not accurately represent our experience. And our experience includes elements which are not included in the picture we have of ourselves. The personality becomes divided with the tensions and inadequate functioning which accompany such lack of unity. So Rogers is sort of assuming that all, or at least the majority of suffering which can be helped with through therapy is of this kind. It's of an incongruence within us, which is leading to defenses which cause suffering. So you may have seen something like this before, a Venn diagram of self and, well, some people say self and self-concept. I'm specifically calling it self-experience. So this is our organismic experience, our organismic valuing process on the left-hand side, and our self-concept on the right-hand side, which is the picture we have of ourselves. So in the middle, we've got our experience, which is allowed into our idea of who we are. So that is congruent. Now, to the right-hand side, we've got stuff that's come into our sense of self, which isn't from us. It's been introduced into us from other people. And this would be where that doctor example would come in. So I didn't actually have a drive, an organismic desire. I didn't see healing wasn't a calling to me. I didn't see doctors growing up and be like, I'd love to be a doctor someday. It came from outside. You will do this. And that's become to be a sense of identity I've claimed that hasn't come from within. Then on the left-hand side, this unintegrated self is experience we have which we've denied or not allowed into our idea of who we are because it's threatening in some way. And that's where that sex example I gave might come in, or masturbation or something, where it's been highly shamed. The organism feels it as good, but family culture sees it as bad, and it's repressed and kept out of awareness. So the ninth concept is then threat and defense mechanisms, which I sort of touched upon them. So an experience which is incongruent with the self structure, so for example, the sex or masturbation example I gave, and its incorporated conditions of worth is subceived as threatening. Subceived means like perceived, but kind of out of awareness. So I might be anxious because my organism has sensed something, but I might not be aware of what that thing is. If the experience were accurately symbolized in awareness, the self-concept would no longer be consistent. The conditions of worth would be violated, and the need for self-regard would be frustrated. A state of anxiety would exist. So I've grown up ashamed of sex and sexuality. I have a sexual experience which I enjoy. That then enters my self-concept, and I suddenly feel like I'm an awful person. Or I try to deny it from my awareness, and I feel sort of anxious or tense in some way. The process of defense prevents these events from occurring through selective perceptual distortion of the experience and or denial to awareness of the experience. So these are the main two defense mechanisms Rogers talks about. And you could really break these down if you wanted to integrate your CBT into this, with all the cognitive distortions would fit in here. If you're into psychodynamic stuff, then lots of Freud's defense mechanisms would fit into this area of the theory. So we distort or deny our experience to fit the idea of ourself which feels acceptable. The consequences of this are a rigidity of perception due to the necessity to distort perceptions, and an inaccurate perception of reality due to a distortion and omission of data. So we're not seeing things clearly if we have too many of these defenses, because we have to constantly distort our experience to fit an acceptable picture of ourselves, which can get us into all sorts of trouble, right? Because reality usually wins out. If significant experience demonstrating this incongruence occurs suddenly or obviously, then our defenses are unable to operate successfully. So I might be able to say to myself, let's take the doctor example. Oh, well, this is just difficult because everyone finds this course difficult. It's inherently it's a really hard thing to do to become an MD. So no wonder I'm struggling here. I can deny the fact that it's not even for me in the first place by just telling myself that lots of people find this tricky, and that's why I'm having difficulty studying or finding motivation. But if, let's say, it became so obvious to me that, oh no, this just really isn't for me, then it's jumped over our defense, it's come into our awareness, and now we're going to have a bit of a breakdown, I imagine. In the freedom of therapy, the individual may find himself on the verge of voicing a feeling which is undeniably true, but which is flatly contradictory to the conception of himself. Anxiety results. And if the situation is appropriate, this anxiety is moderate and the result is constructive. So, like I said at the beginning, we might be aiming for a level of self-awareness, but as that awareness rises, it might contradict our self-concept or our conditions of worth, and therefore we get anxious. But he's saying if that's just the right amount, and it's not too overwhelming, and it's in a therapeutic relationship which is accepting and non-judgmental and all those core conditions, then then the client might just find that place where actually I can let this in to my self-concept. I can change this picture of who I am. And actually, this doesn't mean I'm a bad person that I feel this way. However, if through overzealous and effective interpretation by the therapist, the individual is brought face to face with more of his denied experiences than he can handle, disorganization ensues and psychotic break occurs. This might also be called re-traumatizing sometimes. So if a client, let's say is too overwhelmed with the amount of awareness that's just been brought to them, I don't know, like, oh my God, my mum had been abusing me this whole time. The therapist interpreted it and told the client that it might just be too much for them to take. So this is really key, right? This gap between awareness we've denied or distorted and our self-concept and integrating one into the other is Roger's conception of what therapy is, what we're actually doing. And so there's a balance between fostering that process so that the client can be can do that in containable levels to a way that's not overwhelming. And so reintegration is the final concept, and this is what that would look like. So for a threatening experience to be accurately symbolized in awareness and assimilated into the self-structure, certain conditions must exist. So if we're going to go from a place of, if you remember that Venn diagram, the self-experience and self-concept overlapping, if we're going to try and get those closer together, which is the aim of therapy, to allow more of our true experience into our awareness and our image of ourselves, and to deny and recognize those introjected values that aren't me, that I've internalized but aren't who I am, then these conditions must exist. There must be a decrease in the conditions of worth, and there must be an increase in unconditional self-regard. So I must come to be more accepting of myself if I'm going to allow this process of integration to happen. The communicated unconditional positive regard of a significant other is one way of achieving these conditions. So if I really experience someone else truly accepting me with you know, to a depth to which they've seen me. So I've shared all my shameful things and they've been accepted too. Well, then maybe I just might be able to come to accept myself. Empathic understanding is always necessary if unconditional positive regard is to be fully communicated. If I know little or nothing of you and experience an unconditional positive regard for you, this means little because further knowledge of you may reveal aspects which I cannot so regard. So this is partly why empathy is so important, because you might say you fully accept me for who I am, but if I've not really told you much of who I am, or if I've kept lots of things hidden from you, then it doesn't really matter to me that much you accept what I've told you, because I've only presented what I already find acceptable anyway. It's when I present the things I don't find accepting and you accept those which fosters this process. So when an individual perceives such unconditional positive regard, existing conditions of worth are weakened or dissolved. Consequently, there is an increase in the individual's positive self-regard. Threat is reduced. The process of defense is reversed, and experiences customarily threatening are accurately symbolized and integrated into the self-concept. So I have taught a lot, and those are the 10 concepts I pulled from that chapter that I feel really integrate Roger's theory. And so for the rest of this session, I'm going to stop talking so much, and I really want to open the platform to you guys, and just to invite you to see if any clients have come to mind through this presentation so far, and to spitball some ideas of how we might fit them, how we might formulate them in terms of this theory. So I like this little quote from Rogers because it just it pulls everything together, I think. This is the basic estrangement in man. He has not been true to himself. Oh, I'm aware there's a lot of sexist language in there, which, by the by, Rogers actually later in his career talked about, interestingly, but that's for another day. This is the basic estrangement in man. He has not been true to himself, to his own natural organismic valuing of experience, but for the sake of preserving the positive regard of others, has now come to falsify some of the values he experiences and perceive them only in terms based upon their value to others. The path of development towards psychological maturity, the path of therapy, is the undoing of this estrangement in man's functioning, the dissolving of conditions of worth, the achievement of a self which is congruent with experience, and the restoration of a unified organismic valuing process as the regulator of behavior. So, thank you very much.